What happens when people decide to live at the edge of the world? In Iceland, volcanoes can erupt beneath glaciers. Earthquakes can tear the ground open. Lava can advance toward towns, while sudden floods can burst from beneath the ice. Isolated in the North Atlantic, storms can turn clear roads into whiteouts within 5 minutes. Even the ground beneath your feet isn't completely stable and safe. This is the land of fire and ice, an island where nature can burn you, freeze you, drown you, or force an entire town to evacuate. And yet, Iceland has repeatedly ranked among the most peaceful countries in the world. Nearly 400,000 people haven't simply survived here. They built a modern, prosperous society and learned to turn some of the forces threatening them into part of everyday life. So how did one of Earth's most unforgiving islands become one of its safest places to live? Come with Beyond Travel. We're heading into the fire and across the ice to find out. In November 2023, people of Grindavík were ordered to leave their town. Thousands of earthquakes had been shaking Iceland's Reykjanes peninsula. The ground cracked open across roads and between houses as magma pushed upward beneath the town. Around 4,000 residents evacuated, not knowing whether they would have homes to return to. Then the eruption came. A fissure tore open nearby, throwing fountains of lava into the night sky. More eruptions followed. In January 2024, lava reached Grindavík itself. Houses caught fire, roads were cut off, barriers were built to redirect advancing lava. And this wasn't some once-in-a-thousand-year disaster. The Reykjanes Peninsula has continued through repeated episodes of volcanic activity, a reminder that in Iceland, forces that built the island are still active today. The reason lies beneath almost everything we're going to see. Iceland sits across the mid-Atlantic ridge where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart. At Thingvellir, you can walk through the rift landscape created by that movement. Elsewhere, enormous lava fields stretch toward the horizon. Volcanic craters rise beside roads, and steam escapes through cracks in the earth. But here's the part that makes Iceland so unusual. The heat beneath this dangerous ground is also one of the reasons life here works so well. Across the country, geothermal water is used to heat the vast majority of homes. Combined with hydropower, geothermal energy allows Iceland's electricity generation to come almost entirely from renewable sources, while a winter storm may be raging outside. The same geological system responsible for Iceland's volcanoes helps keep buildings warm inside. Then drive across the black lava fields of Reykjanes and you reach one of the strangest contrasts on the island, the Blue Lagoon. Milky blue water steams between jagged fields of dark volcanic rock. Visitors lower themselves into water kept at roughly 37 to 40 degrees Celsius, while cold air surrounds the lagoon. It looks like a natural hot spring from another planet, but the lagoon is man-made, formed from geothermal seawater connected to the nearby Svartsengi geothermal facility. And Svartsengi lies in the same volcanic region that has experienced the recent eruptions around Grindavík. Think about that for a moment. One force beneath the ground can send people fleeing from their homes. That same underground heat warms homes and has helped create a geothermal spa people travel across the world to experience. This is the first clue to how Iceland survives. People haven't made the island harmless. They've learned to recognize what can be used, what must be monitored, and when nature is telling them to move. If Iceland already feels impossible, Subscribe to Beyond Travel, because we've only explored the fire. Now imagine placing some of those volcanoes beneath hundreds of meters of ice. Above them lies Vatnajökull, an enormous world of glaciers, blue ice caves, and frozen lagoons. And when the fire underneath wakes up, danger doesn't always come out as lava. The danger beneath Iceland doesn't disappear when you reach the glaciers. Sometimes it is simply hidden underneath them. Vatnajökull dominates southeastern Iceland, covering roughly 8% of the country. It is Europe's largest glacier by volume, an enormous ice cap feeding glacier tongues that descend through valleys toward the lowlands. From above, it looks like a frozen world stretching almost beyond sight. But beneath parts of that ice are active volcanic systems. That combination creates one of Iceland's most dangerous natural events. When volcanic activity or geothermal heat melts large amounts of ice beneath a glacier, water can accumulate until it suddenly escapes. Icelanders call these floods jökullaps. They can send enormous volumes of water, ice, and debris rushing across the land below. In Iceland, an eruption beneath a glacier may not send lava toward you. It can send a flood. But when Vatnajökull is quiet, the same ice creates some of the most extraordinary landscapes in the country. Along its edges, meltwater carves caves and tunnels through the glacier. In winter, travelers can enter ice caves where walls glow in shades of deep blue. Layers of compressed ice twist overhead, sometimes streaked with dark volcanic ash from eruptions that happened years or even centuries earlier. The deeper you travel along Iceland's southern coast, the more surreal the landscape becomes. At Jökulsárlón Glacier Lagoon, pieces of the Breiðamerkurjökull Glacier break away and become icebergs. Some are brilliant white, others glow blue or carry black bands of volcanic sediment. They drift slowly across the lagoon before eventually moving through a narrow channel toward the Atlantic, and the ocean sends some of them back. Across the road, waves wash chunks of glacial ice onto a beach made from black volcanic sand. Some are small enough to hold. Others can be larger than a person against the jet-black shoreline. They shine like enormous pieces of glass. That's how Diamond Beach got its name. Few places capture Iceland more perfectly. Ice created by glaciers lying on sand created by volcanoes beside one of the world's roughest oceans. And that ocean brings us to another side of the danger. Farther west lies Reykjanes, one of Iceland's most famous black sand beaches. Behind the shoreline, geometric basalt columns rise from the cliff like a giant stone wall. Offshore, the Reykjanes sea stacks stand against the North Atlantic. On a calm day, the entire place can look almost unreal. But this is not a beach where you casually turn your back on the water. Reykjanes is notorious for sneaker waves, powerful waves that can suddenly surge much farther up the beach than the smaller waves before them. Visitors who believe they are standing safely above the waterline can be knocked down and pulled toward the freezing Atlantic. Fatal accidents have occurred here. That changes the way you look at Iceland's beauty. The glacier you came to photograph can conceal volcanic systems. The black beach that looks perfect from a distance can become dangerous within seconds. Even the icebergs sparkling along the shoreline are the final pieces of a glacier slowly breaking apart. Here, some of the country's most beautiful places are not separated from danger. The danger helped create them. If you were living on an island like this, what would safe even mean? Certainly not eliminating every threat. Iceland can't switch off its volcanoes. It can't stop the Atlantic, and it can't guarantee that tomorrow's weather will look anything like today's. Yet people still drive these roads, raise families here, and build communities beneath mountains that can disappear behind a storm with almost no warning. And this is where Iceland's reputation as one of the world's safest countries begins to mean something very different. Because when nature can change the rules this quickly, survival depends on how quickly people respond. In Iceland, safety doesn't begin with the assumption that nothing bad will happen. It begins with the assumption that something might. The weather alone can prove that quickly. Icelanders have a familiar joke. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. Sunshine can disappear behind rain, snow, or powerful winds surprisingly fast. A road that looks completely manageable when you leave Reykjanes can become difficult or even impassable farther into the journey. In winter, the danger becomes much more serious. Strong winds can drive snow across roads until the landscape turns almost completely white. Mountains disappear. Road markers are difficult to see. Visibility can collapse, and routes through exposed areas may close altogether. So, Icelanders check weather forecasts, wind speeds, road conditions, avalanche warnings, volcanic activity. When authorities close a road or evacuate an area, the message is simple: nature has changed the plan. That attitude became impossible to miss during the volcanic crisis around Grindavík. Scientists tracked earthquakes and deformation in the ground as magma accumulated below the Reykjanes Peninsula. Monitoring didn't stop the eruption. It couldn't. Every year, travelers come here chasing waterfalls, glaciers, remote highlands, and northern lights. Iceland's emptiness can create a dangerous illusion. Reykjavik may feel comfortable and familiar. Drive far enough away, and suddenly there may be very little between you and a North Atlantic storm. When something goes wrong out there, one of Iceland's most remarkable institutions comes into the story: ISAR, the Icelandic Association for Search and Rescue. Its rescue teams are largely made up of volunteers. These are people who train to respond when hikers become lost, vehicles are stranded, storms trap travelers, avalanches strike, or emergencies unfold in remote terrain. When an alert comes, volunteers may leave their ordinary lives behind, put on rescue equipment, and head toward exactly the conditions everyone else is being warned to avoid. The reference script highlights this volunteer rescue culture as one of the clearest expressions of how Iceland's harsh environment has encouraged communities to depend on one another. On an island with only around 400,000 people, that sense of connection reaches beyond emergency rescue. Outside Reykjavik, settlements can become remarkably small. Farms and houses may sit kilometers apart. Fishing communities face an ocean that has supported them for generations, but has never stopped being dangerous. In places like these, knowing your neighbors isn't simply a pleasant idea. Historically, isolation made cooperation practical, and perhaps that helps explain Iceland's strange contradiction. When Iceland is described as one of the world's most peaceful countries, it doesn't mean the environment around its people is peaceful. The ground shakes, volcanoes erupt, storms close roads. The ocean remains unpredictable. The safety comes from somewhere else, from monitoring danger before it arrives, from infrastructure and emergency systems, from people being willing to evacuate instead of trying to prove they can outrun nature, and sometimes from volunteers willing to go searching when somebody doesn't make it home. So perhaps the question isn't how did Iceland remove the danger? It never did. The more interesting question is how people became comfortable building ordinary lives while knowing that danger can return. And nowhere does that feel stranger than during winter. At the darkest point of the year, Reykjavik receives only a few hours of daylight. Snowstorms can rage outside and temperatures drop below freezing. Yet inside Icelandic homes, people may walk around in t-shirts. Across towns, people deliberately change into swimsuits and walk outside into the cold. Then they lower themselves into steaming water heated from beneath the earth. The next clue to Iceland isn't found in how people escape winter. It's in how they learn to enjoy living through it. At the darkest point of winter, Reykjavik gets only a few hours of daylight. The sun rises late, stays low above the horizon, and disappears again in the afternoon. In some towns surrounded by high mountains, direct sunlight can vanish for even longer. But winter doesn't push Icelanders completely indoors. Across the country, people do something that can look almost ridiculous to a first-time visitor. They step outside into freezing air wearing swimsuit. Then they get into the water. Public swimming pools and geothermal hot tubs are found in communities across Iceland. Steam rises into the winter air, while people sit in water heated by the earth beneath them. Snow can be falling around the pool. Darkness can already cover the town, and the temperature outside can be below freezing. But conversations continue in water, warm enough to make the cold feel strangely distant. For visitors, the famous version is the Blue Lagoon. For Icelanders, however, geothermal bathing is much more ordinary. Local pools are places to exercise, relax, and meet other people. The hot tubs can function almost like neighborhood gathering places where conversations happen before work, after work, or during the weekend. In many countries, people meet at a cafe or pub. In Iceland, they may meet half submerged in geothermal water while snow falls around them. And this is where the heat we discovered earlier becomes much more than an energy statistic. Geothermal hot water also runs through heating systems across much of the country. Outside, the wind can be violent enough to make walking unpleasant. Inside, homes remain consistently warm. Icelanders even have a word that captures one of winter's little tricks: gluggaveður, window weather. Farther north, on Grimsey, an island crossed by the Arctic Circle, visitors can experience the midnight sun when the sun remains above the horizon through the night. A winter traveler may chase a few precious hours of daylight. A summer traveler can finish dinner and realize there are still hours of usable light ahead. The same country that spends winter waiting for the sun can spend summer waiting for darkness that barely comes. After more than 1,000 years here, Icelanders have built routines around these extremes rather than expecting the extremes to disappear. Winter brings artificial light, warm homes, pools, and gatherings. Summer opens long days for travel, farming, fishing, and life outdoors. But imagine experiencing all of this before heated homes, paved roads, weather apps, or supermarkets. The island still had volcanic soil. The growing season was short. Winters were long. The North Atlantic was unforgiving. For Iceland's earliest communities, the question wasn't how to make winter comfortable. It was how to make sure there was enough food to survive until spring. And some of Iceland's strangest foods begin to make much more sense once you understand that. Before geothermal heating, supermarkets and highways connected Icelandic communities. Food had to survive the winter just as much as people did. The growing season was short. Grain cultivation was historically difficult, and a failed season could have serious consequences for isolated communities. So Icelanders turned toward the one resource surrounding them on every side: the North Atlantic. For centuries, cod and other fish became central to Icelandic survival and trade. But catching fish was only half the challenge. Without modern refrigeration, it also had to last. The Icelandic climate provided the solution. Fish could be cleaned and hung outdoors, where cold North Atlantic air gradually dried it into harðfiskur, dried fish that could be stored for long periods. What began as a practical way of surviving isolation remains part of Icelandic food culture today. Often eaten with butter as a simple snack on land, sheep became equally important. They could graze across terrain unsuitable for conventional farming and provided meat, wool, and dairy products. Milk also helped produce foods such as skyr, the thick cultured dairy product that has been eaten in Iceland for centuries and is now sold far beyond the island. But perhaps the most Icelandic cooking method doesn't require an oven at all. At Laugarvatn, geothermal heat rises so close to the surface that traditional rye bread can be baked underground. Dough is placed into a container and buried in hot earth near the geothermal area. Hours later, it is dug back up as dense, dark rúbrauð. In Iceland, the ground can erupt beneath a town, and elsewhere, people use that same heat to bake lunch. Some traditional foods become much more challenging for outsiders. Sheep still spread across summer landscapes. Geothermal steam still rises from the earth, and some traditions have survived for an even more remarkable reason. Isolation didn't only preserve food. It preserved pieces of the people who first came here, more than 1,000 years after Norse settlers arrived. Their descendants still speak a language closely connected to Old Norse, read stories rooted in the Viking Age, and ride a breed of horse that has remained isolated on this island for centuries. And once an Icelandic horse leaves Iceland, it can never come home. The Icelandic horse looks perfectly at home here, small, strong, and covered in a thick winter coat. It can be seen crossing green valleys, black volcanic plains, and snow-covered landscapes throughout the country. Its ancestors arrived with Norse settlers more than 1,000 years ago. Since then, Iceland's isolation has helped keep the breed remarkably distinct. The country prohibits the importation of horses, and if an Icelandic horse is taken abroad, it cannot be brought back. The rule helps protect the population from diseases that horses on the island have little exposure to, and they have a movement of their own. Besides the familiar walk, trot, and canter, Icelandic horses are famous for the tolt, a smooth four-beat gait that allows a rider to travel quickly while remaining remarkably steady in the saddle across rough Icelandic terrain. That was more than an interesting characteristic. It made the horse extremely useful for travel. But isolation preserved something even more important than a breed of horse. It preserved a language. Modern Icelandic remains closely related to the Old Norse, spoken by the island's early settlers. While the language has naturally changed over the centuries, Icelanders maintain an unusually strong connection to medieval literature written on the island. That literature includes the Icelandic sagas, stories of families, feuds, voyages, revenge, love, and survival, many set during the first centuries of settlement. In other words, Iceland's Viking past isn't confined to museum displays. It still appears in the language people speak and the stories they grow up with. Even Icelandic names work differently from what many visitors expect. Traditional surnames passed unchanged through generations are less common. Instead, many people use a patronymic or matronymic name derived from a parent's first name, typically followed by a form meaning son or daughter, and people generally address one another by first name. That informality fits a country with a population of only around 400,000, where the social distance between people can feel surprisingly small. Then winter arrives, and another Icelandic obsession takes over. Books. In the weeks before Christmas, Iceland experiences jólabókaflóðið, often translated as the Christmas book flood. Large numbers of new books are traditionally published in the run-up to Christmas, and books are popular gifts. Christmas Eve can end with something remarkably simple: receiving a book and spending part of the evening reading it. It's a quiet tradition for a country whose landscape is anything but quiet. Volcanoes continue to erupt. Technology companies operate from Reykjanes. Tourists arrive with smartphones to chase the northern lights. High-speed internet connects an island once separated from Europe by days of dangerous sailing. Yet horses from the age of settlement still cross the valleys. Old sagas remain part of the culture, and books still occupy an unusually important place in the darkest season. The reference script builds this same contrast between Iceland's modern society and traditions preserved by centuries of isolation, from horses and language to literature. And perhaps living here for more than 1,000 years has also preserved a certain attitude toward uncertainty. Icelanders have an expression, erupt. Loosely, it means something like "it will work out." That can sound surprisingly relaxed, coming from people living on an island where weather changes plans, roads close, earthquakes arrive without invitation, and volcanoes occasionally remind entire towns that nothing beneath their feet is guaranteed. But erupt doesn't have to mean ignoring the danger, because Icelanders do the opposite. They monitor volcanoes, check the weather, close roads, evacuate towns, train volunteer rescue teams. And after doing what they can, there comes a point where nature gets the final say. Maybe that's the idea Iceland has been showing us from the beginning. You prepare for what you can. You adapt when things change. And you accept that some things were never yours to control. Which finally brings us back to the question we started with. How did one of Earth's most unforgiving islands become one of its safest places to live? Perhaps we've been looking for safety in the wrong place. Perhaps Iceland was never meant to be conquered. For more than 1,000 years, people here have lived with a landscape that can change without warning. And somehow, life continues, not because every danger has disappeared, but because living with uncertainty has become part of what Iceland means. Maybe that is what makes this island so fascinating. You come for the fire, the ice, and landscapes that barely look real, but somewhere along the journey, Iceland begins to feel like more than a collection of natural wonders. At the edge of the world, people didn't simply survive. They found a way to call it home. Thanks for traveling with Beyond Travel.